Are the Russians about to declare peace in Ukraine? A unilateral peace? Next month, the annual World Economic Forum will meet in Davos, Switzerland. Prior to the start of the forum, Ukraine President Zelensky will meet with the attendees of the forum to discuss his 10-point peace plan and try to gather support for it. The plan is an amateurish attempt to set Ukraine peace terms that has no chance for peace since it has no grounded basis for a peace formula. And it is one that the Russians have rejected as, quote, non-serious, end quote. The unfortunate fact is that the Russians are right, but the Ukraine plan is the only enumerated peace plan with goals spelled out, other than the Russians' declared war aims as a basis for peace, which is a non-starter for the Ukrainians. There were also leaks that the West was pressuring Ukraine to start peace talks, but so far that has not produced anything but denials from the West. It is starting to look more and more likely that the Russians, instead of negotiating with Ukraine, will declare victory and end the war. But will it work? The Ukraine spring-summer offensive of 2023 made minimal gains despite significant Western material support and was considered a failure. This means that the lines have largely stabilized for over a year, with the Russians expected to launch a winter offensive. The question at this point is, what is the goal of the Russian winter offensive? Is the goal to break the Ukraine defensive network and capture more territory to conquer the Ukraine? This seems doubtful because it is apparent that the Russians, having taken massive casualties, are not capable of launching such an operation or holding additional captured territory. An alternative Russian goal for their winter offensive could be to seize key geographical defensive positions, to improve its defensive lines, and attack Ukraine infrastructure, and to inflict casualties on the Ukrainians without sustaining debilitating casualties themselves. The Russians can absorb many more casualties than the Ukrainians, but President Putin is up for re-election in the winter of 2024. His re-election is a foregone conclusion, but he also does not want high Russian casualties that could be unpopular with the Russian population. Putin does not want his coronation turned into a referendum of the war. The goal of this alternative strategy is that Russia may be preparing to declare victory in the Ukraine and end its official military operations. The advantage of this strategy is that it does not tie down Russia into long negotiations with the West and Ukraine. The result of the failed Ukraine offensive is that Russia strengthened their lines. The strengthened Russian lines have proven that Russia can hold onto its gains in Ukraine, and Ukraine cannot do much about it. The amount of expected aid coming into Ukraine from the West is expected to fall well short of what the Ukrainians need to dislodge the Russians and to recapture regions of territory. This fact, as well as the fact that the Ukrainians do not have demographics and economics on its side to hold out against the Russians over the long term. The Russians have already laying the groundwork, or at least at the minimum a trial balloon of its intent. Russia knows that Germany and other leaders in the U.S. want to have Ukraine pursue negotiated peace with Russia. The Ukrainians are resistant to negotiate with the Russians and to give up territory, thus rewarding Russian aggression. So they know, along with their strength on the battlefield position, the West is realizing the difficulty of continuing the war. Thus, the Russians are estimating that more in the West realize that territory seized by the Russians cannot be recaptured without NATO joining the war. Both NATO and Russia know this will not happen. So the Russians unilaterally declare that its war aims are achieved and the war is over. What does the West and Ukraine do next? Continue to fighting to attain goals that cannot be achieved? The Russians would be in a position that it could withstand continued fighting, knowing that the war will slowly wind down, as the West, having war fatigue, would be willing to assume the status quo in Ukraine rather than continue to fund the war. So it seems like the best way for Russia to end the war on its terms, and it is gambling that the West and Ukrainians, after so many casualties, would be willing to accept it. The danger of this strategy is the war would not officially end, and unlike the Korean War, an armistice would not be signed. How is the Ukrainian West assured that the Russians won't take 10 years to reconstitute its armed forces and try again? So the Russians declaring the war over does not solve any of the Ukraine's security needs from Russian aggression, That was a concern prior to the Russian invasion of 2022. This would also most likely not put the Baltic countries or Poland at ease either. Would Russia accept Ukraine joining NATO, or will that start the war over again? Does NATO reinforce the Baltics for a possible war with Russia? Quitting the war with no negotiated settlement leaves the questions unanswered and could cause missteps that could lead to the restart of the fighting. The idea of Russia declaring an end to the war and taking home its spoils is a reasonable gamble that could work in the midterm. Short term, there will be protests and continued fighting, but in the long term, it leaves too many unanswered questions to make this a sensible option. These unanswered questions will create stability and security issues that will only make Eastern Europe more volatile to another war, with some think tanks and security experts believing that a larger war with Russia would break out within 10 years after the fighting in Ukraine ends. A declared peace would seem to prove that these experts are correct and that another war would be likely. A declared peace with no negotiations would most likely put Europe and NATO on a path to war.